I'm your host, and today I want you to use your imagination for a second. Picture us stepping through the grand front doors of a magnificent, living museum. We're going to take a complete architectural tour of the absolute most vital engine in the human body, the heart. Throughout this explainer, we'll explore every single room, wall, and doorway of this incredible machine, and we'll break down all the complex anatomy into clear, bite-sized pieces. Okay, let's dive right into this. Our tour today is going to cover 6 key stages: an introduction to the heart, its protective walls, the unique cardiac muscle, the upper receiving chambers, the lower pumping chambers, and finally blood flow and valves.
Starting off with Section 1, Introduction to the Heart. Before we start looking at the specific architecture, we really need to understand the sheer scale of the workload this engine handles every single day.
Take a look at this staggering number, 2,600 million. Let that sink in for a second. That's the average number of times a human heart beats over a typical lifetime. And with all those beats, it pumps roughly 155 million liters of blood. It's just a tireless, continuous operation. And amazingly, it actually begins before you're even born.
Now, looking at the external anatomy here, notice its slightly conical shape. It's kind of shaped like a pine cone, right? It sits right in the chest cavity, tucked perfectly between the lungs. But notice how the pointed bottom, which is called the apex, tilts just a little bit to the left. Honestly, it's surprisingly compact. It's only about 12 centimeters long and 8 centimeters wide. In men, it typically weighs between 250 and 390 grams, and in women, somewhere between 200 and 275 grams.
So, to wrap up our intro, the key takeaway here is simple. The heart is a non-stop, lifetime pumping machine that drives our entire circulatory system. It really is the ultimate tireless engine.
Moving right along, let's examine what this engine is actually built out of in Section 2, the heart's protective walls. Because, any high-performance machine needs the exact right materials to protect it and generate power.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly how those walls are constructed. Notice the 3D block cross-section we have up here. On the very outside, we've got the pericardium. That's a protective sac filled with pericardial fluid, which is super important because it completely prevents friction as the heart constantly moves and beats. Then, beneath that sac, the actual wall itself is split into 3 distinct layers. You have the thin outer epicardium, the thick middle myocardium, and finally the smooth inner lining, which we call the endocardium.
But the true star of this protective wall is definitely the myocardium. As you can see from the definition, this is the thickest middle layer of the heart wall. This is the true muscle of our engine, and it's the part that's actively responsible for those incredibly powerful contractions that push blood throughout your entire body.
So, what exactly is that muscle made of? Let's zoom in a bit closer for Section 3, the unique cardiac muscle. Zooming all the way down to the microscopic level, we see something totally distinct. Unlike the skeletal muscle you'd find in your biceps, these cardiac muscle cells are beautifully branched, creating this vast, complex network. And notice those dark lines connecting the cells? Those are called intercalated discs. They act as absolutely vital communication bridges, allowing electrical signals to pass rapidly from cell to cell. This ensures the whole heart contracts in perfect, synchronized unison. To quickly sum up these incredible little cells, they are tiny, only about 0.8 millimeters long and 12 to 15 micrometers wide. They're wrapped up in a fine protective skin called a sarcolemma. Their sarcoplasm is packed with contracting myofibrils, and, as we just saw, they're tightly connected by those critical interconnected discs. But perhaps the wildest part? Their action is entirely involuntary. You literally don't have to think a single thought to make your heart beat. Which brings us to our main highlight for this muscle section. Cardiac muscle is a highly specialized tissue that is completely involuntary, and miraculously, it never experiences fatigue. Think about that. It never gets tired, unlike literally every other muscle in your body.
All right, now that we know what the walls are made of, let's step inside the building for Section 4, the upper receiving chambers. The heart is perfectly structurally divided into 4 distinct rooms.
Let's move to the inside and see how this builds into a functioning pump. Looking at this detailed cross-section, focus on the top half for a second. These 2 upper rooms are called the atria, and they are completely separated from each other by an internal dividing wall, which is known as a septum.
Now let's compare their specific jobs, because they do different things. The right atrium, which is on the left side of the image, receives oxygen-poor or CO2-rich blood returning from the entire body.
And crucially, the wall of the right atrium houses the sinoatrial, or SA node. You can think of the SA node as the heart's built-in electrical power grid. It basically acts as your natural pacemaker. Meanwhile, the left atrium has a totally different job. It's receiving freshly oxygenated O2-rich blood directly from your lungs.
So the big takeaway here? Just think of the atria as the heart's primary receiving rooms. Their main job is just to gather up the incoming blood, whether that's from the body or the lungs, and prep it to be sent right downstairs.
And that naturally brings us to the downstairs floor. Section 5, the lower pumping chambers. If the upper rooms are just for receiving, while these lower rooms are built for the heavy lifting.
Focusing our attention on the bottom half of the heart now, you'll see the two ventricles. Again, just like upstairs, they are separated by a thick internal wall, this one called the interventricular septum. But just visually, right off the bat, you can immediately tell these chambers look way different from the atria. Their walls are highly muscular.
When we compare them side by side, it's a perfect example of form following function. The right ventricle really only has to pump blood a very short distance, just right next door to the lung so it can pick up some oxygen. But the left ventricle? It has a massive job. It has to pump oxygen-rich blood through the aorta all the way to the absolute tips of your fingers and toes. Because of this immense workload, the left ventricle's walls are significantly thicker and stronger than the right side.
So, our key architectural adaptation here is pretty simple. The left ventricle is by far the most muscular chamber, specifically because it requires immense pressure to pump blood to your entire body via the aorta. Okay, we've seen the walls and we've toured the 4 rooms. For our final stage, Section 6, let's turn the engine on. Let's look at blood flow and valves.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is getting to watch this biological engine in motion. If you follow the arrows on screen, blue represents the CO2-rich blood, and pink represents the oxygen-rich blood. Notice the distinct doorways the blood passes through? Those are your valves. We have the tricuspid valve on the right, the bicuspid or mitral valve on the left, and the semilunar valves at the exit points. These act as strict one-way doors. They're locked into place by structural cords, making sure blood flows forward and never, ever backwards.
Let's rapidly walk through this continuous loop step by step. Step 1, CO2-rich blood enters the right atrium. Step 2, it drops through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle, which pumps it straight out to the lungs to breathe. Step 3, that freshly oxygenated blood returns, entering the left atrium. Step 4, it drops down into that thick-walled left ventricle, which powerfully squeezes it out to nourish your whole body. It's an incredible cycle.
We'll end our architectural tour with this final thought, which honestly I find absolutely awe-inspiring. This beautifully structured sequence, powered by a muscle that quite literally never fatigues, begins in the 4th week of embryonic development. You are barely a tiny cluster of cells when this engine turned on, and it never, ever rests. So what does that tell us about the sheer perfection of biological engineering inside each and every one of us? Thank you so much for exploring this fascinating anatomy with me today. Stay curious and keep learning.